Automotive history is filled with a number of strange and unique engines that powered vehicles over the years. Everything from engines that came out in the pre-war era, including the Tatra 87 2.9-liter air-cooled V8 engine, to some more modern engines. There have been a lot of different power plants under hood in many vehicles, and let's just say on-the-road vehicles in general, because there's some really strange ones that appeared in medium and heavy-duty vehicles as well. This particular video is going to focus on strange and unique engines that you possibly may have never heard of unless you've been a frequent viewer of this channel. And even frequent viewers of this channel are going to find at least one or two on here that they probably didn't know of. And we're going to focus, as I mentioned, on the domestic vehicles for this particular video, but there could be a whole nother video on strange engines that were put under hood of foreign cars. But we'll save that for another day and start the video off with number 10. At number 10, we have an engine that was introduced for the 1961 model year and designed by Buick, and that is an all-aluminum 215 cubic inch V8 engine. Now, this 215 cubic inch V8 engine appeared in GM's new so-called senior compacts. They're introduced for the 1961 model year. They're called senior compacts because they're a little bit larger than the Corvair that was introduced for the 1960 model year. And those senior compacts included the Pontiac Tempest, the Oldsmobile F85, as well as the Buick Special. Now, the 215 cubic inch V8 was only the standard engine in the latter two, the Olds and the Buick. The standard engine in the Tempest was Pontiac's Trophy 4, but we're going to save that for a few minutes down the road here. In any case, this 215 cubic inch engine represented GM's really first mass market foray into an aluminum block V8. And as I mentioned, it was just 215 cubic inches. It was not designed to be powering full-size cars, but really was designed to help provide a lightweight power plant under hood in those senior compacts. In fact, one of the things that GM had actually tried in those senior compacts was orienting the 215 cubic inch engine transversely within the engine compartment and having those cars be front-wheel drive, but that was later scrapped in favor of a conventional front-engine rear-drive layout, although GM did employ a smaller rotohydromatic transmission in those vehicles, which enabled them to have a smaller transmission tunnel in the floor pan, which gave more passenger space. Unfortunately, that rotohydromatic did not prove very reliable, at least in this form, which was a different rotohydromatic than what was offered in the full-size cars. These 215 cubic inch aluminum V8s did have a little bit more challenges associated with them and warranty issues versus the cast iron engines that were typically found under hood of the full-size cars. But by and large, they were pretty good engines overall. In fact, there would be a particular variant that I'm going to save for a bit later on this list that would be spawned in the Oldsmobile Jetfire that actually was the first, or at least one of the first, turbocharged V8s offered in the world in mass market vehicles. But this 215 cubic inch V8 would be dropped after the 1963 model year, as customers really didn't care much about fuel economy during this time period. When the engine was developed in the late 1950s, it was a time when customers really didn't have as much disposable income due to an impending recession. But by the time the mid-60s rolled around, the economy was doing well and gas prices were cheap. And as a consequence, GM ended up selling the engine to Rover, and it became one of the most successful engines ever overseas and was produced all the way until the 2006 model year. It also spawned what is one of the most successful V6 engines in history, and that is the Buick V6 that many of you would know later as the 3.8 or 3800 V6. And that engine we're going to talk about now as number 9. At number 9, as I mentioned, we have the Buick V6. And, well, why is this on the list, you may say? Everybody knows the Buick 3800, and, well, that's pretty true. It was a tried and true engine design that many knew from the 1980s and 1990s and even into the 2000s. It was actually last produced in 2008, and many people had these under the hood in their vehicles. However, we're going to focus on the early Buick V6 engine, and these are the variants that most people may not know about, or at least don't know the history of them. Well, I just told you that this Buick V6 was spawned from that aluminum block 215 cubic inch V8 that I mentioned before. And it really came about because that 215 cubic inch V8 was just expensive to produce, and Buick division was looking for a way to lower the base price of its Buick Special automobile. And one of the ways they thought that they could do that was to lop 2 cylinders off of that 215 cubic inch V8 and make it out of cast iron as opposed to aluminum, because it was a lot easier to build and consequently much cheaper. However, that decision endowed this Fireball V6 with a number of flaws. The first was that it shook quite a bit owing to its 90-degree bank angle between cylinders and an uneven firing pattern, at least in these early years, as the crankshaft had only 3 crank pins that were set 120 degrees apart, and opposing cylinders, for example, cylinders 3 and 4, would share a crank pin. The uneven firing pattern associated with the design of this engine would continue all the way until 1977, when Buick redesigned the crankshaft to have a split pin configuration and created the so-called even firing version that helped significantly smooth the vibrations. Vibrations would be further smoothed in 1988, when the engine would be significantly redesigned with one of the cylinder banks now offset from the other cylinder bank, and a balance shaft was added for smoothness. The other piece that many don't know about this Buick V6 is that it actually was sold by GM to Kaiser Jeep, and they began using the Buick V6 in 1965, but bought the tooling from General Motors in 1967. Interestingly, later on, after the oil crisis, GM would buy back this tooling from American Motors in April of 1974, and Buick was then able to reinsert the V6 into its lineup in 1975 models. It was something that actually took a lot less time than General Motors manufacturing engineers anticipated, because the foundations for the old Buick V6 machinery were still intact at the Flint, Michigan assembly plant, despite the fact that Buick had sold the tooling to AMC. In any case, as time would go on, that Buick 3800 V6 would become one of the most famous engines in automotive history. But the early years, the Buick V6s weren't nearly as great as what they ended up being, generally because of the roughness, and that owed itself to the design of the engine. Let's move on to number 8. At number 8, we have Pontiac's 1 year only, at least in the Pontiac brand, 336 cubic inch V8. In the late 1950s, Pontiac's sister division, GMC, was actually using Pontiac V8s under the hood of a number of its heavy-duty trucks. The Pontiac 336 cubic inch engine was effectively a smaller version of first the Pontiac 370 and then subsequently the Pontiac 389 when the 389 was introduced in the 1959 model year. And despite the fact that GMC called these a 336, they were different because they were spawned from either the 370 cubic inch V8 or the 389 cubic inch V8. Well, when Pontiac introduced its Tempest in 1961, the standard engine was the Trophy 4-cylinder that I'll talk about in a few minutes, and optional was the Buick 215 cubic inch aluminum V8 that I also previously mentioned. However, in 1963, Pontiac ended up dropping that Buick 215 cubic inch V8 and superseding it with what they called the Pontiac 326 cubic inch V8. The idea there was that the so-called 326, I should call it, was a cast iron engine, and it was very cheap to manufacture, easy to manufacture, and very reliable. And what Pontiac ended up doing was effectively taking the 336 from the GMC trucks that it had been producing for a number of years prior and just dumping that into the Tempest and calling it a 326, presumably because GM upper management forbid any engine larger than 330 cubic inches in these small vehicles. Well, it made a lot of sense. Who's going to complain about getting a few extra cubic inches for free, basically? Apparently, though, GM senior management got wind of it and actually made Pontiac change the bore size from 3.78 inches to 3.72 inches for the 1964 model year. So the 1963 Pontiac 326s actually have a little bit larger bore than the 1964 through 1967 Pontiac 326 cubic inch engines. So if you get that 1963 Pontiac 326, You get a few extra cubes and I guess a little bit more extra pep. But either way, any one of the Pontiac 326s is just a great engine, even the ones that were in the GMC trucks. Let's move on to number 7, and that is the Cadillac V6s. And yes, I said V6s, plural, and there's a distinct reason for that. Back in the 1930 year, when these Cadillac V6s were first produced, Cadillac really was the standard of the world, and pulling up to any event in a Cadillac signified that you were an extremely wealthy individual and had considerable means. Well, for 1930, Cadillac really wanted to push into the upper stratosphere and introduced a Cadillac V16 that displaced 452 cubic inches and had a narrow 45-degree V-bank angle. It was also an overhead valve engine. This particular V16 engine was really a tour de force for the time period. Unfortunately, though, it was not a sales success. In its inaugural year in 1930, again, we're in the middle of, let's say, some unfortunate circumstances in the U.S. from an economic perspective. Cadillac sold about 2,500 of these V16 powered cars. And each year thereafter, sales really decreased. In 1931, they sold about 750. 1932, about 300. And then it really went down into the 100 or 50-ish each year, all the way through to the 1937 model year. And that's when, in 1938, Cadillac decided to actually introduce a completely different 16-cylinder engine for the 1938, 39, and 1940 model years. This engine, as opposed to the previous overhead valve engine, was actually a flathead design, and opposed to having a 45-degree bank angle, had a 135-degree bank angle. It also came equipped with 2 fuel pumps, 2 carburetors, 2 distributors, 2 water pumps, and a 9-bearing crankshaft. The goal here was really production efficiencies and economies of scale, as this flathead Cadillac V16 was able to use far more components with other Cadillac engines at the time than the previous overhead valve 45-degree bank angle V16. Unfortunately, sales were still not that brisk, despite the fact that this V16 really was a great luxury car and the U.S. economy was starting to recover. Only 315 were sold in 1938 and about 150 in 1939 and 1940. And perhaps this is because a lot of the vehicles that had the V16 under hood cost the equivalent of about $160,000, $170,000 in base price. And that was a fair amount of coin, obviously a lot of coin for anyone. But regardless, these V16s are just absolutely amazing vehicles, even by modern standards. But many people don't know that there were actually 2 Cadillac V16s that were completely different in overall design. The one that was produced from 1930 to 1937, and the second that was produced from 1938 to 1940. After that, Cadillac would never produce a V16 again, except for the Cadillac 16 concept in the early 2000s. Let's move on to the next engine in our countdown, and that is the previously mentioned Pontiac so-called Trophy 4 4-cylinder engine. As I mentioned, Pontiac introduced its senior compact Tempest in 1961, and the Tempest had a lot of really unique features. Not just this Trophy 4-cylinder engine, which I'm going to talk about, but a rear-mounted transaxle. That's right, the transmission was actually in the rear of the vehicle, the so-called Tempest-Matic, which actually had an exposed torque converter that you could see spinning from the rear of the car if you looked underneath it. It also had a so-called rope drive shaft that was flexible or bent in the middle. And part of the reason for that was to actually help quell some of the vibrations of this Trophy 4-cylinder engine. Now, why did this Trophy 4-cylinder have vibrations? Well, it was effectively half of a 389 cubic inch V8. And as you can see here, it is literally half of a 389. It only has the passenger side of the V. The driver's side of the V is missing, and there are some things in its place, like a starter. But this 194.43 cubic inch 4-cylinder or 3.2 liter 4-cylinder is absolutely huge. Certainly the largest 4-cylinder made by General Motors in passenger vehicle form, and had a bore of 4 1/16 inch and a stroke of 3 3/4 inches. It came in all different types of horsepower ratings. At the low end in 1961 was 110 horsepower single barrel engine. And at the upper end for 1961 was a 155 horsepower engine. Now in 1962, you could get a 4-barrel power pack Tempest with the Trophy 4 that was rated 166 horsepower. So quite a versatile engine. Overall, it really wasn't a bad engine from a durability standpoint. It did have some timing chain issues, more than the typical Pontiac V8 did of the era, really because of the vibrations associated with this engine. And the vibrations were, I would say, relatively significant. So much so that Pontiac even had to redesign its air cleaner setup so that it had a bracket that would keep it in place and not enable the shaking engine to move it around. But it was, like I said, an overall relatively reliable engine, aside from the vibrations, and certainly a unique approach. Some would say the later Pontiac engineered Iron Duke engine of the late 70s that was introduced in the Astra and later made its way into many GM vehicles in the 1980s, and even the Grumman LLV postal vehicle was effectively half of Pontiac 301, and that's just simply not true. It did share the same bore and stroke and some components with the 301, but the engine was not like the Trophy 4, and it was not half of a 8-cylinder. This Trophy 4 was actually literally half of an 8-cylinder engine, and frankly, for a cheap engine, it did pretty well. I think another interesting solution was that in producing the Trophy 4, obviously Pontiac wanted to run this engine down the same machining lines as the V8, and it could because it was literally half of a V8 engine, but in order to minimize tooling wear, they would run the 4 cylinders down half of the machining line for part of the week and the other half of the machining line for the other part of the week. And this really ensured that the machining lines were wearing evenly across both the left and the right-hand side banks. Unfortunately, this Trophy 4 didn't last very long. It lasted for the 1961 to 63 model years, and that was it. And in 1964, the Tempest would be redesigned to be a bigger car, and the Trophy 4 would be replaced as the base engine. But for a few model years at least, it provided a strange and quirky engine under hood, and one that you may not have heard of. Let's move on to number 5 in the countdown, and that is an Olds diesel that you may not have heard of, the Oldsmobile 4.3-liter V8 Diesel. Now, many of you have heard of Oldsmobile diesels, in particular the 350 cubic inch V8 diesel that was introduced in 1978, or some of you have even heard of the 4.3-liter V6 diesel that could be found under hood in the A cars like the Cutlass Sierra, as well as the C cars, the Oldsmobile 88, 98, Cadillac DeVille, Fleetwood, etc., at least for 1 year, 1985 only. But many don't know that in 1979 and 1979 alone, Oldsmobile actually had a 4.3-liter, 260 cubic inch diesel engine that made all of 90 horsepower. Yes, I said that right, 90 horsepower. It found its way under hood in the GM intermediates of the era. These would be the rear-wheel drive intermediates, like the buttless Cutlass, the Cutlass Salon, and the Buick Century, etc. And it was only a 1-year-only engine, presumably because the car was just anemically slow with this 90 horsepower V8 diesel under hood. And Olds ended up dropping it, but keeping their 350 diesel, and obviously would introduce a 4.3-liter V6 diesel. That 4.3-liter V6 diesel was found under hood in the transversely mounted engine and transmission vehicles, whereas this 4.3-liter V8 diesel was found longitudinally mounted under hood. The Olds diesel obviously had a number of problems associated with it. Everything from inadequate clamping force because Olds effectively used the same head bolts and head bolt pattern as the gasoline V8, to some injection pump failures, to really a principal flaw with the Oldsmobile diesels, which was that, at least in the V8 form, they never got a water separator. And with diesel fuel not being great quality during this time period, that really was a flaw. If you got water in the fuel, some of the Olds diesel-equipped cars would have a little flag that would pop up on the instrument cluster, but you effectively then just had to have the car towed to the dealer. So I don't know why, but throughout their entire run, no Oldsmobile V8 diesel got a water separator from the factory, and that really was just a shame because it created so many different problems. But this 4.3-liter V8 diesel, well, it, in addition to those problems, just had no power, and for that reason, it lasted only 1 year. Let's move on to the next engine in our lineup, and that is the Cadillac V864 engine. The V864 engine was, again, one of these one-year-only engines. It was only in Cadillac passenger vehicles for the 1981 model year, though it did continue on in limousines for at least one more model year after that. Now, the unfortunate part of the V864 is that it really was based upon what was a reliable, good engine, Cadillac's 368 cubic inch V8, which was a downsized 500 cubic inch V8. So the same block that produced the Cadillac 500 that could be found under hood of Eldorados and in some cases other Cadillacs from 1970 to 1976 yielded this, well, relatively puny by the standards, 368 cubic inch V8. Now, the 368 was introduced in the 1980 model year and really didn't have too many issues. But for 1981, Cadillac wanted to do something different, I suppose, really in the name of fuel economy, and introduced the V864, an early cylinder deactivation setup. Obviously, cylinder deactivation was novel at the time, and now it's commonplace. So the idea was good, but in practice, the execution was just not up to snuff. In a number of cases, the engine would be stuck operating in 6 or 4-cylinder mode and wouldn't revert back to 8-cylinder mode for either mechanical or electronic reasons, which included the computer, which was relatively frail on these. But in any case, the V864 just wasn't a success. Part of it was that reliability issue I mentioned, although you could just deactivate the setup and the engine became perfectly reliable. And some of it was that, in particular, that 6-cylinder mode was imbalanced and the engine had a strange shake to it. And this is why when you see cylinder deactivation on V8s today, they just go from 8 cylinders to 4. There's no intermediate 6 cylinders. Another issue associated with this was that the throttle body injection setup that was used on these was not optimal from an overall economy and efficiency standpoint. You can imagine if you had multi-port injection and you were shutting down cylinders, that would be much better. But these engines employed a throttle body setup. So for the reliability reasons, as well as the roughness of operation, it just was not something that Cadillac buyers in particular were used to. They were used to very, very smooth engines that were always smooth. This engine failed and lasted all of 1 year. And for that reason, it makes this list. Let's move on to number 3, and that is the Oldsmobile Jetfire Turbo 215 cubic inch V8. Now, we already talked about the 215 cubic inch V8 in standard form and how it was introduced in the 1961 model year in the Buick Skylark Special, as well as the Oldsmobile F85. But what we haven't yet talked about is the turbo version of this engine in Oldsmobile's Jetfire. The Jetfire was introduced for the 1962 model year and came with the turbocharged 215 cubic inch engine, which made 215 horsepower, up from the 4-barrel non-turbo version that made 185 horsepower. So it gave a little bit more power and actually even had 300 pound-feet of torque at about 3,000 RPM in 1962. So it endowed the car with a fair amount of scoot. It was about 0 to 60 in 9 seconds, which for a compact car of the time was quite fast. Overall, the Jetfire engine was really far ahead of its time and was capable of producing more torque than engines that were considerably larger in size. But the turbocharging came with some reliability issues. In particular, the owners of these vehicles would forget to fill up their turbo rocket fluid under hood in the vehicle, which was a fluid, I believe, effectively methanol-based or something similar. I've heard people even ran bourbon in the turbo rocket fluid reservoir, and it was successful. In any case, if that turbo rocket fluid weren't present, the engine would cut its boost pressure, and it would feel like it would just fall on its face. And people weren't used to really putting this fluid under hood or understanding what turbocharging meant from a drivability standpoint, that there was a bit of turbo lag, etc. And so while the engine was certainly cool, it really didn't last very long. In fact, after 1963, the Jetfire would be no more, and its turbocharged V8 would be pushed out to pasture. But for 2 model years, it really was super cool, and some would say this Jetfire was actually America's first turbocharged V8. I don't know if this came first or the Corvair Monza. Some debate that. I think the Jetfire may have beat the Corvair Monza by a month or so in the marketplace. In any event, they were pretty much contemporaneous. But those vehicles, the Jetfire and the Corvair Monza, really introduced turbocharging to the American public. And this Jetfire is just a super cool engine overall. Let's move on to number 2, and that is the 702 cubic inch GMC Twin 6 engine found in heavy-duty trucks. So for these final two, we're going to move to some strange GMC engines because GMC had some of the coolest engines of all time under hood of their heavy-duty trucks. And as I said, this Twin 6, or the so-called Twin 6, the 702 cubic inch 11.5 liter V12 is certainly one of those super cool engines. This 702 cubic inch engine shared many different parts with a GMC V6 that could be found under hood in light duty as well as heavy duty pickups, the 351 cubic inch V6. You'll note here, in fact, that the 702 cubic inch Twin 6 has basically the V6 valve covers that are borrowed from it, and the heads as well, but the block is cast as one piece and is a true V12 block. Now, GMC did produce many different six-cylinder engines, 305, 351, 401, 478 cubic inches. Yes, a 478 cubic inch V6 with a 60-degree bank angle as well. And they also produced a 637 cubic inch 60-degree V8, which I recently made a video on. Be sure to check my channel for that video. But this Twin 6 was, I think, the coolest of all and was certainly the largest of these V6 derivatives. It had a 4.56-inch bore, a 3.58-inch stroke, very short stroke. The thought there was that the shorter stroke would basically prevent more wear in the cylinders because the piston wasn't traveling up and down as much as if the stroke were longer. The engine produced 275 horsepower at 2,400 RPM, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it did produce 630 pound-feet of torque at 1,600 RPMs. And as I mentioned, it was a single block casting, but it did have clearly 4 exhaust manifolds, 2 carburetors, 2 intake manifolds, 2 distributors, although the distributors were driven, I should say 2 distributor caps, they were driven by a single distributor drive. So a lot of different parts were shared with that 351 cubic inch V6. In any case, the 702 is just an awesome monster, and many people aren't aware that GMC produced their own V6, much less this Twin 6. One last little interesting factoid is that you'll notice the spark plugs are not present in between the exhaust manifolds. That's because they're in the middle of the V. GMC thought that on these heavy-duty engines, it wasn't best to have the spark plugs and the spark plug wires really close to the exhaust manifold because they get a little crispy being in extreme heat and in heavy-duty cycles. Not a bad idea, but one I really haven't seen replicated since. Let's move on to number 1 now. And that is, well, a whole suite of GMC Toroflow diesels. I just talked about a series of V6 engines that General Motors produced in, well, really from 1959 all the way through 1974. But what many people don't know is that GMC actually produced a diesel version of some of these engines. More specifically, a diesel version of the 351 and 478 cubic inch 6-cylinder, as well as the 637 cubic inch V8, known as the Toroflow diesel. GM obviously had a diesel division at this time called Detroit Diesel that produced 2-stroke engines like the 671, the 6V71, and even a 12-cylinder 12V71, and a whole slew of engines in between. And that is a whole nother story. I'm just mentioning some of the Detroit diesel engines. There were others, the 8V92, etc. But this Toroflow was different from those. Those Detroit diesels were 2-stroke diesel engines. This Toroflow was a 4-stroke diesel. And this really represents the first time, I believe, that General Motors tried to dieselize a gas engine. It obviously did bolster the gas engine block and a number of internal structural components to create the diesel, but it started with V6 and V8 engines to create the Toroflow. One really interesting feature about the Toroflow, aside from the fact that it was a dieselized gas engine in effect, or at least had that as a starting point, is that the intake and the exhaust manifolds and ports are on the same side of the engine. So notice here in the picture that the intake is on the outside of the bank, not on the inside. And that's because GMC had to use the interior of the bank to basically have the injection pump and things that were unique to the diesel. So they placed the intake on the outside. Overall, the Toroflows were okay diesel engines. They weren't great. They weren't horrible. They weren't as reliable as the Detroit Diesel 2-strokes. But they're an engine that many people haven't heard of, and I think they're just super cool overall. So that's why they're number one on this list. Hope you enjoyed this list of some interesting engines produced by General Motors over time. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you.